This video is for section 7.1. Our objective in this section is to evaluate square roots. So a square root is the opposite of a square. So to find the square root of a number, we undo squaring. So for example, I know that 5 squared is 5 times 5, which is 25. I also know that negative 5 squared is negative 5 times negative 5. Since negative times negative is positive, that's also positive 25. So for the square roots of 25, there are two of them, 5 and negative 5. So I can say that 5 and negative 5 are square roots of 25. Now, we often see the square root symbol, and that has a meaning that's a little bit different. So when we use the square root symbol, what we use it for is what's called the positive or the principal square root. Which means that we only take the positive value. So just like in the example above, it works for any number. If I were to take the square root of, for example, 49, I could say that 7 squared is equal to 49, or negative 7 squared is equal to 49. There's always going to be two possibilities. But when I use the square root symbol, I only want to put the positive one. So if I were to say square root of 25 under the square root symbol, that's equal to 5. So I'm only looking for the positive value. Now, if I put a negative sign in front of the square root symbol, like this, then what I do by order of operations, I do the square root first, and then I put the negative sign on. So square rooting is a form of exponents, and that's exponents is going to come before multiplying by a negative number in order of operations. So the square root comes first, and then I make it negative. So that's going to give me negative 5. Now you have to be careful because that's not quite the same thing as if I write the square root and I put the negative underneath the square root. So if I were to take square root of negative 25, this is not a real number. And we're going to talk more about square roots of negative numbers in a few sections. But for now, what you want to be aware of is that it's not a real number because you can't multiply a number by itself and get a negative. So like we saw in chapter 5, if you're multiplying two numbers and you get a negative number, that means that one has to be positive and one has to be negative. And if you have one positive and one negative, they're not the same number. So we're going to look at example 1, and we're only going to do some of these problems. As you see, there's multiple letters in example 1. We're just going to do A, B, and C because those are going to be most relevant to what we're looking at later. So it says to evaluate, and A is square root of 81 with the square root symbol. You should find a square root button on your calculator. If you don't have these down very well in your head, feel free to use a calculator, that's fine. So square root of 81, I know that 9 squared is 81. So that means that the square root of 81 is 9. And remember, we're only taking the positive value. Negative 9 squared is also 81, but we're looking for the principal square root here. For B, this is taking the square root of 9 and then making the answer negative. So I know that 3 squared equals 9. So for this, I would take the square root of 9, which is 3, and then add a negative sign in front. So that's going to be negative 3. Part C is a fraction, and we're taking the square root, so this is a little bit different. In this situation, what you can do is break up the square root symbol so that you're taking the square root of the numerator and the denominator separately. So we have square root of 4, which is 2, and square root of 49, which is 7. So this would be 2/7. So you should look next at checkpoint problem number 1, parts A, B, and C. Do these in your notes, check your answer, and then move on to the homework for this section.